Welcome to Fireside Casebook. Come in. There's another mystery waiting by the fire.
Chapter 1. The wind, the wet, and the worse. The wind sweeping off the loch was not so much a breeze as a personal insult. It howled down the chimney of the Lochdubh police station, sending a puff of acrid peat smoke into the already dingy office, and rattled the window panes with the force of a battering ram. Police Constable Hamish Macbeth sat with his long, booted feet propped squarely on his desk, a mug of lukewarm coffee balanced precariously on his chest. He was a lanky Highlander with a mop of fiery red hair, hazel eyes that usually looked half asleep, and an inherent allergy to ambition. At his feet lay Lugs, a dog of indeterminate breed and magnificent ugliness, currently twitching in his sleep, dreaming perhaps of chasing the local butcher's van. The telephone on the desk began to ring. It was a harsh, shrill sound. Hamish didn't move a muscle. He knew exactly who it was. It was Strathbane headquarters. More specifically, it was likely Detective Chief Inspector Blair, a man whose sheer existence was a blight on Hamish's otherwise perfectly orchestrated life of doing as little official police work as humanly possible. Blair would want reports. Blair would want statistics. Blair would want Hamish to do something that involved forms in triplicate. Hamish let it ring 5 times, 6 times, 7 times. Finally, the ringing stopped. He let out a long, contented sigh and reached into his uniform pocket, pulling out a slightly bruised apple. "Aye, Lugs," Hamish murmured, his soft Highland burr barely audible over the roaring wind outside. It's a grand day to be absolutely useless. He was just contemplating whether it was too early to head down to the Italian restaurant to mooch a plate of spaghetti when the front door of the station was thrown open. The wind rushed in, scattering a neat stack of blank charge sheets across the floor. Framed in the doorway stood a man who clearly did not belong in Sutherland, let alone Lochdubh. He was dressed in a pristine olive-green Barber jacket that had never seen a speck of genuine mud, tight beige corduroys, and Hunter Wellingtons that looked as if they had been polished that very morning. He had silver hair slicked back from a tanned forehead, and a mouth drawn into a tight, impatient line. "Is there a police officer in this god-forsaken hovel?" the man barked, stepping inside and slamming the door behind him with unnecessary violence. Hamish slowly, very slowly, lowered his feet from the desk. He let his jaw go slightly slack and widened his hazel eyes, assuming the mantle of the village idiot, a disguise he wore like a second skin whenever confronted with an angry Sassenach. If there was one thing Hamish had learned, it was that if you looked stupid enough, people from the city generally left you alone and took their trouble elsewhere. More importantly, looking stupid kept him firmly anchored in Lochdubh, safe from the horrifying threat of a promotion to Strathbane. "I am the police," Hamish said, his voice slow and mild. "Can I help you, sir?" "Bartholomew Sterling," the man snapped, marching up to the desk. He smelled overpowering of sandalwood and expensive arrogance. "I recently purchased the old McFarlane Croft up on the Brae. I am transforming it into a luxury mindfulness retreat, a place for stressed executives to reconnect with nature." "Is that a fact?" Hamish said mildly, taking a deliberate bite of his apple. "Nature's a bit damp up here, Mr. Sterling." "I am well aware of the weather, Constable," Sterling sneered, glancing around the shabby station with undisguised contempt. "What I am not accustomed to is the absolute lawlessness of the locals. I demand you do something about Angus MacDonald." "Angus?" Hamish scratched his head. "Has he been giving you trouble?" "His sheep are entirely unmindful of my property boundaries." Sterling slammed a gloved hand on the desk. "They have trampled the foundations of my meditation labyrinth. Furthermore, the man had the audacity to laugh in my face when I threatened him with a lawsuit. I want him arrested. Trespassing, vandalism, and harassment." Hamish chewed his apple thoughtfully. In his mind, he was already formulating a plan. He knew perfectly well that the McFarlane Crofts' fences hadn't been repaired since the late 80s, and Angus's sheep had been grazing that brae since before Sterling was born. But pointing out the nuances of Scottish crofting law to a red-faced Londoner was too much like hard work. "Well now," Hamish drawled, staring blankly at Sterling. "Arresting sheep, that's a tricky one. Handcuffs just slip right off the trotters, you see." Sterling's face turned an impressive shade of magenta. "Are you being insolent with me, Constable?" "Not at all, sir. I'll be sure to go up and give Angus a stern talking to. Very stern." Hamish pulled a stub of a pencil from his pocket and made a show of writing sheep in large, clumsy letters on a scrap of paper. "I'll tell them to stay out of your, what was it, the maze? Labyrinth?" Sterling hissed. "I can see the rumours about the local constabulary's incompetence are entirely founded. I shall be speaking to your superiors in Strathbane. Good day to you." He spun on his heel and stormed out, leaving the door slightly ajar so the bitter wind could snake back in. Hamish tossed the pencil aside and sighed. "Well, Lugs," he said to the dog, who had cracked open one eye to assess the threat level before going back to sleep. That's a man begging for a thump on the nose. He stood up, stretching his long frame. The peace of the morning had been thoroughly shattered. It was time for a patrol. He grabbed his peaked cap and heavy waterproof coat. Leaving the station, he walked down the waterfront. The village of Lochdubh was a line of whitewashed cottages huddled against the edge of the dark, churning loch, backed by towering mountains that looked bruised purple in the stormy light. It was isolated, nosy, and perfect. Hamish's first stop was Patel's grocery and curry shop. The bell clanged cheerfully as he pushed the door open. "Ah, Hamish," Mr. Patel greeted him from behind the counter. "Terrible day." "Aye," Hamish agreed, shaking the water from his coat like a wet dog. "Have you had the pleasure of meeting a Mr. Bartholomew Sterling yet?" Patel's friendly face darkened. "That man, he came in yesterday, demanded to know if my turmeric was ethically sourced and single origin. Then he told me my shop smelled too strongly of cumin for a civilized village. I told him he was free to buy his groceries in Strathbane." Hamish nodded, committing the interaction to memory. He picked up a slightly squashed local newspaper and wandered further down the aisle. A few minutes later, he stepped out and crossed the street to the post office, the central hub of all Lochdubh intelligence. Inside, the Curry sisters, Angela and Florence, were sorting the morning mail with bird-like efficiency. "Morning, ladies," Hamish said, taking off his cap. "Constable Macbeth," Angela said, her nose twitching. "Have you arrested that dreadful man yet?" "Mr. Sterling?" Hamish asked smoothly. "What's he done to you, then?" "He came in to post a parcel to London," Florence piped up, her round face indignant. "Told us we were working at an appallingly glacial pace. Then, when Angela offered him one of her homemade shortbreads, he looked at it as if it were poison and said it was a fast track to coronary heart disease. He insulted the shortbread." Hamish feigned horror. In truth, Angela's shortbread could double as masonry, but one simply did not say that out loud in Lochdubh. "The man is a menace." "Mrs. Haas min Neoshenkoisa. Wellington is furious with him as well," Angela gossiped, leaning over the counter. "He interrupted the minister's sermon on Sunday to suggest the acoustics in the kirk were damaging his aura. The minister's wife looked ready to brain him with a hymn book." Hamish thanked the sisters and stepped back out into the Scottish squall. He shoved his hands deep into his pockets, his sharp mind whirring beneath the facade of the lazy village bobby. Bartholomew Sterling had been in Lochdubh for exactly 3 days, and he had already alienated the grocer, insulted the postmistresses, enraged the minister's wife, and declared war on the local sheep farmer. Hamish looked up the brae toward the old Macfarlane Croft, barely visible through the driving rain. A Sassenach with money and a terrible attitude was a volatile element in a village like this. Lochdubh had a long, long memory, and its residents did not take kindly to being treated like ignorant peasants. "He's beautiful to watch his step," Hamish muttered to the wind, "or the labyrinth won't be the only thing getting trampled." His stomach gave a loud rumble. Sterling's impending social doom could wait. Right now, Hamish needed a free lunch. He turned his boots toward the Tommel Castle Hotel, hoping he could talk the chef out of a bowl of venison stew before the day got any worse. Chapter 2. A ruined lunch and a ridiculous corpse. The venison stew at the Tommel Castle Hotel was a thing of rare beauty. Thick, dark, and smelling of rosemary and red wine, it was exactly the sort of meal that made Hamish Macbeth feel a temporary surge of goodwill toward humanity. He was just lowering his head to inhale the steam, a hunk of crusty bread poised in his right hand, when the double doors of the dining room burst open. "Hamish! Hamish, are ye in here?" It was Willie Lamont, the hotel's junior porter, his face the colour of skimmed milk. Hamish froze, his eyes closing in a brief silent prayer that Willie would simply go away. He did not. "It's awful, Hamish," Willie panted, rushing over to the table and hovering nervously. "You've got to come quick. It's that English fellow up at the Macfarlane Croft, the meditation one." "Mr. Sterling?" Hamish sighed, slowly lowering his bread. The stew seemed to mock him, cooling rapidly in the draught from the open door. "Has he arrested a sheep, Willie? Because I told him only this morning that handcuffs slip right off the trotters." "He's dead, Hamish," Willie blurted out, his voice cracking into a high squeak. "Angus MacDonald found him. Says he's tangled up like a fly in a web." Hamish stared longingly at his bowl. Murder was always an inconvenience, but a murder right before lunch was a personal tragedy. Furthermore, a dead Sassenach meant only one thing: Strathbane headquarters, flashing blue sirens, and the impending arrival of Detective Chief Inspector Blair. His quiet, lazy week was officially irreversibly ruined. "Right," Hamish said heavily. He scooped a quick, enormous spoonful of stew into his mouth, chewed with grim determination, and stood up. "Come on, Lugs." The drive up the brae in the police Land Rover was treacherous. The rain had intensified into a biting sleet that lashed against the windscreen with a sound like throwing gravel. When Hamish finally pulled up to the old McFarlane croft, Angus MacDonald was standing by his idling tractor, smoking a damp roll-up cigarette and looking profoundly unbothered by the weather or the corpse. "Over there," Angus said, jerking his chin toward what used to be a rather lovely patch of wild heather. Hamish pulled his heavy waterproof collar up against the biting wind and trudged through the muck, Lugs trotting miserably at his heels. Bartholomew Sterling's meditation labyrinth was a series of concentric circles marked out by expensive white river stones. In the very centre of it lay the man himself, and the sight was decidedly undignified. Sterling was face down in a deep puddle of black peat bog. He was wearing his expensive beige corduroys, but over them he had donned a flowing, embroidered silk kimono that was now caked in dark, freezing mud. Worse, he was thoroughly entangled in bright orange, heavy-duty plastic sheep netting. It wrapped around his legs, his torso and his neck in a chaotic web. One stiff hand was outstretched, tightly gripping a large, smooth chunk of pink rose quartz. "He was putting up the netting to keep my ewes out," Angus noted, ambling up behind Hamish and peering down. "Looks like he tripped in the mud and strangled himself. Clumsy." Hamish let his mouth hang open in an expression of dim-witted bewilderment. "Aye, Angus, clumsy." But behind his vacant hazel eyes, Hamish's sharp mind was already cataloguing the scene. Sterling hadn't just tripped. The bright orange netting was tied in a very specific tight knot around his ankles, a knot that looked suspiciously like a clove hitch. A city man like Sterling, who complained about the smell of village groceries, wouldn't know how to tie a proper clove hitch if his life depended on it. Which, apparently, it had. Furthermore, Hamish noted the missing left Wellington boot. Sterling's left foot, clad only in a damp argyle sock, was exposed to the freezing rain. Why would a man lose a boot while setting up a fence? And then there was the smell. Beneath the sharp, natural scent of wet earth and sheep droppings, Hamish caught a faint, unmistakable whiff of cheap blended whisky. Sterling had struck Hamish as a gin and tonic or herbal tea sort of man. "Do not touch anything, Angus," Hamish instructed, pitching his voice to sound sufficiently flustered and out of his depth. "I'll have to call Strathbane. They'll want the forensics lads up here." "Blair," Angus grimaced, spitting into the long grass. "Aye, Blair," Hamish said, feeling a familiar knot of dread tighten in his stomach. If Hamish solved this too quickly, or too publicly, Blair's superiors might finally notice that the lazy Highland copper was the only one closing cases in the entire county. That would mean promotion. It would mean moving to a city filled with traffic, noise, and real, constant crime. It would mean leaving the misty, quiet isolation of Lochdubh. Hamish looked down at the ridiculous, silk-clad corpse in the mud. He would have to figure out who tied that clove hitch, who walked off with a solitary Wellington boot, and who hated Bartholomew Sterling enough to silence him. But he would have to do it by mooching tea, gossiping with the locals, and pretending to be absolutely clueless while Blair stomped around making a fool of himself. He patted Lugs on the wet head. "Well, boy," Hamish murmured, "we'd best go phone the circus." Chapter 3. The circus comes to town. The wail of the sirens echoed off the dark, brooding mountains surrounding Lochdubh long before the cavalcade of police vehicles came into view. Hamish Macbeth stood in the freezing drizzle, Lugs shivering against his Wellington boots, and watched with profound melancholy as his peaceful afternoon was officially pulverized. 3 Strathbane police cars, their tyres tearing up the muddy, narrow track of the Bray, slid to aggressive halts near Angus MacDonald's tractor. The doors flew open, disgorging a small army of uniformed officers, a forensic photographer, and finally, the dark, squat figure of Detective Chief Inspector Blair. Blair stepped out into the Highland muck and immediately scowled, as if the weather itself was a personal affront designed to annoy him. He was a barrel-chested man with a face like a bulldog that had been denied a sausage. He wore a rumpled trench coat, and the scent of stale cigarette smoke and cheap peppermints drifted off him like a toxic fog. Behind him trailed his perennial shadow, Detective Sergeant Jimmy Anderson, looking hungover and thoroughly miserable. "Macbeth?" Blair barked, his raspy voice cutting through the wind. "Don't just stand there gawping like a stunned mullet. Where's the body?" Hamish arranged his features into an expression of vacant, mild-mannered subservience. He touched the brim of his peaked cap. "Right this way, sir. Just up in the labyrinth, they call it." Blair snorted, a sound of wet derision. "Labyrinth? What in God's name are you blathering about, you useless tutor?" "Stones, sir," Hamish said slowly, gesturing with a heavy arm. "In circles." Blair stomped past him. Anderson and the forensic team in tow, ignoring the designated path and trampling straight over a patch of rare wild orchids. Hamish followed, at a lazy, shambling pace, keeping his sharp hazel eyes on everything and his mouth firmly shut. When Blair reached the corpse of Bartholomew Sterling, tangled in the bright orange sheep netting and draped in the mud-caked silk kimono, he let out a bark of harsh laughter. "Well, well, looks like the fancy Sassenach got himself in a bit of a tangle," Blair said, leaning over the body with all the grace of a reversing dump truck. "Slipped in the mud, wrapped himself up in the wire and choked. Accidental death. Christ, Macbeth, you dragged me all the way from Strathbane for a clumsy idiot who can't walk and put up a fence at the same time." Hamish scratched his jaw, looking terribly confused. "Well, sir, I thought it was best you had a look. It's just, that's a fierce knot around his ankles." Blair squinted at the orange netting, then dismissed it with a wave of his meaty hand. "He thrashed about, didn't he? Tightened the plastic himself in a panic. Basic physics, Macbeth. Not that they teach that in the village school. And his boot, sir." Hamish pointed a long bony finger at Sterling's exposed argyle-socked left foot. "It's gone missing. Sucked into the bog," Blair snapped, losing his limited patience. "Anderson, get the photographer to take some snaps of the mud, find the boot, and let's wrap this up before I catch pneumonia." "I don't think it was an accident, sir," Hamish mumbled, pitching his voice to sound hesitant and foolish. "Angus MacDonald found him, and Mr. Sterling had a terrible row with Angus yesterday about his sheep trespassing." Blair froze. His small piggy eyes lit up with the predatory gleam of a lazy policeman who had just been handed an open and shut case. "MacDonald?" Blair turned, his gaze fixing on the farmer who was still leaning casually against his tractor in the distance. "The man who owns this exact type of sheep netting. The man who was threatened with a lawsuit by the victim." "Aye, sir," Hamish said innocently. "But Angus wouldn't." "Shut up, Macbeth. Your brain is clearly as waterlogged as this blasted hillside." Blair rubbed his hands together, a terrifying smug smile stretching across his face. "It's a clear case of murder. MacDonald got sick of the Londoner throwing his weight around, came up here, shoved him in the mud, strangled him with his own netting, and left him to rot." "But what about the missing boots, sir?" Hamish asked again, playing the dimwit perfectly. "And the smell of cheap whisky on a man who only drinks herbal tea. Details, Macbeth. Irrelevant details." Blair jabbed a thick finger into Hamish's chest. "This is why you'll die a rural constable. You have no vision, no instinct for the big picture. Anderson, go and put the cuffs on MacDonald. Read him his rights. I want him in an interview room in Strathbane by 4 o'clock. Hamish watched, his face a mask of lazy indifference, as Anderson trudged off to arrest the entirely innocent crofter. Internally, Hamish sighed. Angus wouldn't kill anyone. He was far too stingy to waste good sheep netting on a murder, and he would never have tied a city knot like a clove hitch. Blair had taken the bait, blinding himself to the real clues. The Strathbane circus was now focused entirely on the wrong man, leaving Hamish free to wander the village, drink tea, and find the real killer under the radar. He tipped his hat to Blair, who was already shouting orders at the paramedics. "I'll just get out of your way then, sir," Hamish murmured. "Leave the real police work to the experts, to the experts." Chapter 4. The Art of the Strategic Scone. The rain had settled into that persistent, dreary Scottish drizzle that seemed to seep into one's very bones. Hamish watched from the shelter of the bus stop as Angus MacDonald was unceremoniously bundled into the back of a police cruiser. Angus looked more annoyed than terrified, mostly because he'd been dragged away from a half-finished mug of tea at the pub, but the sight still sat ill with Hamish. "Come on, Lugs," he muttered, turning his back on the circus. "Time for a little investigation, I think." Hamish didn't head for his office. He headed for the only place in Lochdubh where a man could get the truth, provided he was willing to trade enough sugar for it. Mrs. Elspeth Grant's tea room. Elspeth was a woman of formidable opinions and even more formidable baking skills. She sat behind her counter knitting a sweater that seemed large enough to fit a small whale, her eyes scanning the village street through the window like a hawk. When the bell jingled and Hamish stepped in, she didn't smile, but she did stop knitting. "So they've taken Angus," she said, skipping the pleasantries. "A fafty vinded. Blair is a fool, and the local news is saying the man from London was murdered for his sheep." "A ridiculous notion." "It is that," Hamish agreed, sliding onto a rickety wooden chair. He pulled a face of weary resignation. "The DCI is a busy man, Elspeth. He needs a quick resolution. He doesn't have the time to look for missing boots or wonder why a man who hated alcohol was found smelling like a distillery." "Whisky?" Elspeth raised a thin eyebrow. "Are you certain?" "Faintly, but it was there," Hamish said. He watched her carefully. "You've been serving the village, Elspeth. You've seen everyone coming and going. Who did the Londoner have any dealings with before he became a permanent fixture in the mud? Elspeth stood up and fetched a plate with a mountain of buttered scones and a pot of dark, strong tea. She set them down with a clatter. "Eat, Hamish. You look as though you've been living on air." Hamish didn't need to be told twice. He poured a cup, added enough sugar to turn it into syrup, and took a bite of a scone. Mr. Fryby Thomas's scorn. Mr. Fryby Thomas's scorn. Mr. Fryby Thomas's scorn. Sterling, Elspeth began, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, was a man who liked to talk, but never liked to listen. He had a meeting yesterday afternoon, not with a local, but with a woman who drove up from the south in a car that cost more than my house. A very glamorous, very sharp-looking lady. Did she have a name? She didn't introduce herself to me, but she was overheard arguing with Sterling near the war memorial. Something about assets and selling out. He was quite loud, shouting that he'd reclaim his birthright and that she could go back to her playboy. Hamish chewed slowly, his mind turning the information over. A woman in a fancy car, a dispute over assets, and a claim to a birthright. This wasn't about meditation labyrinths or trespassing sheep. This was about money and a past that Sterling had tried to bury in the Highland mist. Did anyone else see her? Old Mrs. McPhee saw the car leave, Elspeth said, leaning forward. She said the woman looked frantic. She nearly backed into the stone wall outside the hotel, and she wasn't wearing boots, Hamish. She had on those delicate city-style pumps, not the sort of thing you wear in a wet meadow. Hamish felt a spark of interest. You wouldn't happen to know which direction she headed? North, toward the main road, she replied. Hamish finished his skull, wiped the crumbs from his moustache, and stood up. You're a marvel, Elspeth, truly. Don't flatter me, you lanky rogue, she scolded, though a faint smile touched her lips. Just make sure you don't let that loud-mouthed DCI ruin the village reputation. If he pins this on Angus, he'll be in for a rough time from the women of this parish. We've all got rolling pins, and we know how to use them. As Hamish walked back out into the rain, he felt a strange sense of clarity. The accidental death in the bog was looking less and less like an accident. If Sterling was involved in a dispute over property or inheritance, he wasn't killed for being an annoying neighbour. He was killed because he held something, or knew something that someone else wanted enough to commit a crime for it. He thought about the missing boot. If someone had killed Sterling, they would have had to get close to him, likely in the mud. A pair of delicate city pumps would have been a liability. Perhaps one had been lost in the struggle, and the killer, in their haste to flee, had only retrieved one, or perhaps the other had been purposefully discarded or hidden. He whistled for Lugs, who was busy sniffing a discarded crisp packet near the gutter. "Come on, lad. Let's take a walk by the hotel. Maybe we'll find a lost shoe or a very guilty-looking stranger." He knew the path to the truth wouldn't be easy, and he had to keep up the appearance of being the useless PC Macbeth, or Blair would find a reason to drag him into the interrogation room as well. He needed to be invisible, persistent, and perfectly wonderfully lazy. He pulled his cap low, hunched his shoulders against the wind, and began his stroll, looking for all the world like a man with absolutely nowhere to go and nothing to do. Chapter 5. A Slipper and a Secret. The Tommel Castle Hotel was a grand, draughty Victorian pile that loomed over the village like a stone sentinel. Its gravel driveway, usually a pristine expanse, was currently churned into a grey soup by the tyres of the various police vehicles. Hamish ignored the main entrance where DCI Blair was loudly berating a terrified desk clerk, and instead skirted around the back toward the staff entrance. He found what he was looking for in a discarded pile of waste near the kitchen bins. A single, black, high-heeled pump. It was sodden, ruined by the grit of the Highland track, and utterly mismatched to the rugged terrain of Lochdubh. Hamish picked it up with a handkerchief, turning it over in his hand. It was an expensive brand, the kind one saw in glossy magazines rather than on the muddy lanes of Sutherland. "Find something, Hamish?" Hamish jumped, or at least he did a very good impression of a man startled out of his wits. He turned to see Priscilla Halberton Smythe, the daughter of the local grandee, and a woman who possessed a sharp, aristocratic wit that could flay a man at 20 paces. She was draped in a waxed barber coat that actually fit, looking annoyingly elegant despite the driving rain. "Just bit of rubbish," Hamish stammered, shoving the shoe behind his back. "Terrible weather, isn't it, Miss Halberton Smythe?" Priscilla stepped closer, her keen blue eyes narrowing. "Don't Miss Halberton Smythe me, Hamish, and don't hide the evidence behind your back like a schoolboy caught with a comic book. I saw you looking at that shoe. It belongs to the woman who was staying in the bridal suite, doesn't it?" Hamish sighed, realizing that deceiving Priscilla was like trying to outrun a gale. "You saw her, I saw a very distressed creature in a ridiculous car tearing down the drive at dawn, Priscilla said, crossing her arms. She looked as if she'd been dragged through a hedge backward. Her name is Eleanor Vance. She claimed to be a consultant for Mr. Sterling's project, but she didn't look like a consultant. She looked like a woman who had just realized her inheritance was slipping through her fingers. Hamish took his hand from behind his back, revealing the muddy shoe. She lost this, it seems, and I suspect Mr. Sterling lost a boot in the same struggle. Priscilla stepped closer, her expression turning serious. Hamish, Blair is currently terrorizing the village. He's convinced himself that poor bumbling Angus is a cold-blooded killer. If you know something, you have to tell him. Hamish let out a long, weary breath. If I tell Blair, he'll storm in, scare the witness, break the case, and get the credit. And then Priscilla, he'll see that I've been doing the actual legwork. He'll decide I'm wasted here and have me transferred to Glasgow or Edinburgh. I cannot go to the city. I'd die of boredom and bad air in a week. Priscilla looked at him for a long moment, a ghost of a smile playing on her lips. She understood him better than perhaps anyone in the village. You are an infuriating man, Hamish Macbeth, truly. But you're right. Blair is an oaf. What do you need? Information, Hamish said softly. You know everyone who comes to the hotel. Was Eleanor Vance really a consultant? She was Sterling's sister, Priscilla corrected, her voice dropping, estranged by the sound of things. The hotel manager, Mr. Henderson, heard them fighting through the walls last night. She was demanding her share of the family trust. Sterling refused. He was planning to funnel everything into his mindfulness vanity project to spite her. A motive, Hamish murmured. And the whiskey smell. Was he a drinker? Sterling, heavens no. He was a health fanatic. He thought sugar was a moral failing. Hamish nodded. So someone forced him to drink, or the whiskey was used to mask something else. Or perhaps it was a clumsy attempt to make him look like a local drunk. Blair would love that angle, Priscilla mused. It fits his prejudice perfectly. Exactly, Hamish said. He glanced toward the front of the hotel, where Blair was just stepping out, his face purple with rage as he shouted into a mobile phone. I need to get this shoe to a lab without Blair seeing it, and I need to know where Eleanor Vance went. She checked out at 6 this morning, Priscilla said, checking her watch. She said she was heading back to London, but she left a trail of chaos in her wake. Hamish, be careful. If she's desperate enough to kill for an inheritance, she's desperate enough to do something stupid. I'm a local policeman, Priscilla, Hamish said, flashing his most disarming vacant grin. The only thing I do is be careful, and occasionally I get lucky. He tucked the muddy shoe into his deep pocket, patted Lugs on the head, and began to shuffle away, looking for all the world like a man just heading home for a nap. But as he turned the corner, his gaze was fixed on the road south. Eleanor Vance might have left, but she had left a piece of herself in the bog, and Hamish was going to make sure that piece of evidence told the whole story. Wait, Hamish, Priscilla called out. He stopped and turned. If you catch her, don't let Blair be the one to do it. He'll make a circus of the trial. Let the truth come out properly. I'll do my best, Hamish said, and for a fleeting second his eyes were as sharp and clear as the mountain air. Then, the mask of the lazy policeman slid back into place, and he ambled off into the rain. Chapter 6. The Unfortunate Case of the Missing Inheritance. The following morning dawned with a deceptive pale beauty. The rain had ceased, leaving the Highland air crisp enough to snap like a dry twig. Hamish, however, was in a foul mood. He had spent the better part of the night sitting in his tiny kitchen, staring at the muddy high-heeled pump and nursing a pot of coffee that was thick enough to pave a driveway. He had checked the local records. Eleanor Vance had indeed checked out of the Tommel Castle Hotel, but she hadn't headed south as she claimed. A quick, surreptitious inquiry at the petrol station down the road revealed that a woman fitting her description had stopped for fuel, but she hadn't turned toward the main highway. Instead, she'd been seen heading up the narrow, winding back road that led toward the desolate moorlands, the very place where Sterling's retreat was being built. She went back to the scene of the crime, Hamish muttered to Lugs, either to retrieve that boot or to finish something she left undone. Hamish didn't call for backup. He didn't even put on his formal uniform. He grabbed his old battered raincoat, checked that his torch was working, and whistled for Lugs. They set off on foot, taking the shortcut through the heather, leaving the village before DCI Blair had even finished his first cup of breakfast tea. The moor was a vast, rolling landscape of brown and purple, silent save for the occasional mournful cry of a curlew. By the time Hamish reached the old McFarlane Croft, his legs were aching and his boots were sodden again. The scene of the murder was cordoned off with cheap, flapping police tape that had already been partially shredded by the wind. He didn't cross the tape. Instead, he circled wide, moving with the practiced, silent gait of a poacher. He reached the back of the small stone barn which sat on the edge of the property and pressed his back against the rough, cold masonry. There, parked in the shadow of the barn, was a sleek silver convertible. It looked entirely out of place, its polished finish dulled by a layer of fine grey dust and dried mud. And there, pacing around the meditation labyrinth, was Eleanor Vance. She wasn't wearing her heels. She was wearing a pair of thick, practical boots that clearly didn't belong to her. As she walked, she looked down at the ground, her hands clenched in her coat pockets. She was searching. Hamish watched from the shadows. She was looking for the other shoe. Or perhaps she was looking for something else. Something Sterling had been holding, something he had died for. Suddenly she stopped. She fell to her knees in the center of the labyrinth, clawing at the mud with her bare hands. A moment later she pulled something out of the muck. It wasn't a shoe. It was a small, leather-bound notebook. She opened it, scanned the pages, and a look of pure, unadulterated relief washed over her face. She began to laugh, a thin, brittle sound that carried across the quiet moor. "Found it, have ye?" Hamish stepped out from behind the barn. Eleanor jumped, dropping the notebook into the mud. She whirled around, her face pale and pinched. She looked like a trapped animal, her eyes darting toward her car, and then back to Hamish. "Who are you?" she hissed, her voice trembling. "Just the local copper," Hamish said, his tone deliberately slow and thick with his heaviest Highland accent. He took a step forward, looking as unthreatening and dim-witted as possible. "I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to step away from the evidence, miss. This is a crime scene after all." Eleanor scrambled to her feet, her composure fracturing. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. This is a private family matter." "Murder is rarely private, Miss," Hamish said, his gaze drifting toward the notebook in the mud. "And that looks like an awful lot of paperwork for a holiday. Is that the trust agreement?" "It's my life," she snapped. "Bartholomew was going to destroy it. He was going to give everything to his ridiculous retreat, leaving me with nothing. I just came to talk to him, that's all." "And the netting?" Hamish gestured toward the scene of the crime. "Did you and he have a friendly chat about tying knots too? Because that's a very professional-looking clove hitch." Eleanor went rigid. "I didn't kill him. I found him like this. I tried to help him, I swear. I lost my shoe in the struggle to reach him, and then I realized, if the police found out I'd been here, they'd think I did it. So I ran, and left your brother to die in the mud." Hamish's voice, usually soft and drawling, held a sudden sharp edge of steel. Eleanor recoiled as if he'd struck her. For a moment, the mask of the pampered socialite slipped, and Hamish saw the desperate, frightened woman underneath. "I didn't kill him," she whispered, "but I know who did. And if I tell you, you'll never be able to keep it a secret from that horrible man in the village. He'll make sure I pay, just for being here." "Try me," Hamish said, his eyes scanning the horizon. He knew Blair would be waking up soon, and the peace of the moor wouldn't last. "But make it quick. The law is coming, and it's about as subtle as a landslide." Chapter 7. The witness in the heather Eleanor Vance stood in the middle of the labyrinth, the cold wind whipping her hair across her face. She looked at Hamish, then at the notebook in the mud, then back to the horizon, as if expecting the entire Strathbane constabulary to descend upon them at any moment. "You don't understand," she said, her voice brittle. "Bartholomew wasn't alone when I arrived. I saw someone leaving. Someone who knew this land well enough to cross the bog without leaving a trace." Hamish didn't move. He kept his posture loose, his shoulders hunched in the universal sign of a man who would rather be doing anything other than police work. Someone from the village? Or someone else? A man? He was tall, wearing a thick dark wool jumper, and a cap pulled low. He wasn't walking like a local Hamish. He was walking with purpose, carrying something heavy. When he saw me, he didn't run. He just stopped, looked at me, and tipped his hat. It was the most chilling thing I've ever seen. Hamish felt a cold prickle at the back of his neck. A tall man in a dark jumper, comfortable in the mud, with the icy nerve to acknowledge a stranger while leaving a crime scene. "Did you recognize him?" "No," Eleanor whispered. "But he was holding a bottle. He tossed it into the tall grass near the fence line before he disappeared into the mist." Hamish looked toward the area she indicated. It was a dense patch of gorse and heather, thick enough to hide a small mountain, let alone a discarded glass bottle. He stepped over the police tape. DCI Blair would have had a stroke, and walked slowly toward the spot. He didn't find the bottle, but he found something else, a set of boot prints. They weren't the size of Sterling's expensive loafers, nor were they the delicate impression of Eleanor's pumps. They were deep, heavy, and spaced in a way that suggested the man had been carrying a significant weight. And there, caught on a sharp thorn of the gorse, was a snag of coarse grey wool. "Eleanor," Hamish called out, his voice now crisp and devoid of his usual drawl. "You need to leave. Drive toward the coast, not the highway. If you're stopped, you were never here. You were at a bed and breakfast in Inverness." "Why are you helping me?" she asked, bewildered. "Because you didn't kill him," Hamish said, his eyes scanning the moor, "and because I don't like being played for a fool by people who think they can hide their sins in my village. Go." She didn't need telling twice. She grabbed the notebook, scrambled into her convertible, and within seconds the silver car was a disappearing speck on the horizon. Hamish stood alone on the moor, the snag of grey wool held between his thumb and forefinger. He knew that wool. It was hand-knitted, the kind of heavy, oily yarn the fishermen and older crofters used to keep out the biting damp of the North Sea. He thought of the people in Lochdubh. The minister, too thin; the postmistress's brother, too short; Mr. Patel, too fond of his own tailored jackets. Then it hit him, the hotel porter, Willie Lamont. Willie was a quiet, unassuming boy, always hovering in the background, perpetually ignored. He was tall. He wore exactly that kind of thick, grey, hand-knitted jumper, and he knew every inch of the surrounding hills. And more importantly, Willie had been the one to find the body and alert Hamish. He had been the first on the scene, giving him ample time to plant evidence, move things, or simply observe. Why would a quiet, lazy porter kill an arrogant English stranger? Hamish remembered the conversation he'd had with Elspeth. Sterling had been reclaiming his birthright, shouting about his property, and dismissively treating everyone like an inferior servant. Hamish realised he had been thinking about the money, but he hadn't been thinking about the land. The McFarlane Croft hadn't just been a plot of land for a retreat. It held the old family burial ground of the original crofters, the families who had been forced out generations ago. Many of the families still living in Lochdubh, including the Lamonts, had ancestral ties to that soil. Sterling wasn't just building a retreat. He was planning to excavate the site, effectively desecrating the resting places of the village's ancestors, to build a meditation zone. Hamish felt a wave of grim understanding. It wasn't about the sheep. It wasn't about the money. It was about pride, heritage, and the burning, deep-seated resentment that people in the Highlands often kept tucked away behind a facade of polite indifference. He looked down at the snag of grey wool. He had the motive, he had the suspect, and he had the location. Now he had to prove it, without DCI Blair ever knowing he'd had a hand in it. "Come on, Lugs," Hamish said, his voice quiet. "We've got a visitor to see, and we'd better make sure we don't bring the circus with us." He turned and began the long walk back to the village, his mind already weaving the trap. It had to be subtle. It had to be perfectly, frustratingly lazy. And above all, it had to be a solution that made Blair look like he had stumbled onto the truth all by himself. Chapter 8. The Tea Time Trap. The kitchen of the Tommel Castle Hotel was a sweltering, chaotic hive of activity. The smell of frying onions and boiling cabbage hung heavy in the air, masking the more subtle scent of damp wool that Hamish was hunting for. He leaned against the doorframe, nursing a mug of tea that looked as though it had been brewed in the late 90s, and watched the staff darting about. Willie Lamont was over by the deep freezer, heaving a heavy crate of potatoes. He was wearing the thick, grey, hand-knitted jumper. It was a sturdy, ugly thing, perfectly suited for a man who spent his life hauling luggage and supplies through the horizontal rain of a Highland winter. "Heavy work, that, Willie," Hamish drawled, his voice lazy and drifting. Willie jumped, nearly dropping the crate. He turned, his face flushed. "Aye, constable. Just sorting the stock. Mindfulness, is it?" Hamish chuckled, watching the boy's eyes. Sterling, the man who passed away, he was a great one for that, building his labyrinth up on the brae. Willie wiped his hands on his trousers, his movements jerky. "I wouldn't know, sir. Just a guest, really." "Shame about his death, though," Hamish continued, taking a slow sip of his tea. "Terrible business. Clumsy way to go. Tangled up in that netting. Blair is convinced it's the farmer, Angus. Arrested him yesterday, you know." Willie stiffened. "Angus? But he wouldn't. He's a good man." "Aye, he is," Hamish agreed. "But Blair needs a culprit, and Angus is a convenient one. Poor fellow will likely spend the rest of his days in a cage because he didn't have an alibi for when the poor English chap met his end." Hamish watched Willie's hands. The boy was twisting a piece of loose thread on his cuff. A thread that matched the coarse grey wool Hamish had found on the gorse bush. "Funny thing, though," Hamish mused, looking up at the ceiling as if counting rafters. "I found a bit of evidence near the scene this morning. A piece of fabric. Someone's clothing must have snagged on the gorse. A bit of grey wool, hand-knit. The forensics boys from Strathbane will be running tests on it tomorrow. They'll be checking the knit patterns against every jumper in the village." Willie went perfectly still. They'll be doing that?" "Oh, Hamish lied with the confidence of a man telling the truth. "Blair's obsessed with the textiles. Says the killer left a signature in the wool. He's going to be going door to door, village to village, checking every jumper in the parish. Once they match the wool, it's a simple matter of checking the DNA traces they found on the netting." Hamish sighed, shifting his weight. "It's a bit of a waste of time, if you ask me. I told him he'd be better off looking for that missing boot, but he says the wool is the smoking gun." He watched Willie closely. The boy's breathing had become shallow. He was looking at his own sleeves with a kind of terrified fascination. "Well," Hamish said, pushing off the doorframe. "Better get back to it. I've to meet Blair at the hotel entrance in an hour. He's demanding a full list of everyone who was near the brae that morning. He's going to start with the staff. He's a thorough man, Blair. A bit of a bulldog." Hamish turned to leave but stopped at the door. "Oh, by the way, Willie, if you see any discarded gear, bottles, boots, anything like that, you'd best report it right away. Blair's in a mood to arrest anyone who even looks suspicious." He didn't wait for a response. Hacoitha thanktha, half the viblonizations de villaged source the undihin baitha thavanda. He walked out into the cool, damp air of the hotel courtyard, his heart thumping a steady rhythm in his chest. He hadn't mentioned DNA. There was no DNA on the netting. He'd checked that himself, and Blair wasn't doing any textile analysis. He was currently sitting in the local pub, nursing a whisky and complaining about the quality of the local hospitality. But Hamish knew the power of guilt. He had planted the seed of the forensics team and the wool test. For a boy like Willie, whose life was lived in the shadow of authority, and who had clearly acted on a moment of desperate protective anger, the fear of the thorough DCI Blair would be enough to make him crack. Now, he just had to wait. If he was right, Willie would panic. He would try to dispose of the jumper, or the boot, or the bottle, and in that panic, he would lead the police, or at least a policeman, right to the final damning piece of evidence. Hamish leaned against the cold stone wall, pulled out a stale biscuit, and fed half to Lugs. "We've got him, boy," he whispered. "Now we just need to make sure he confesses to the right person." He glanced at his watch. The trap was set. Now the village of Lochdubh just had to hold its breath. Chapter 9. The Confession in the Rain. The evening settled over Lochdubh with a heavy, bruised purple hue. Hamish didn't go back to the station. Instead, he retreated to the small stone bridge that crossed the burn running behind the hotel. A perfect vantage point. From here, he could see the back entrance of the Tommel Castle, the path leading to the staff quarters, and the dense, dark thicket of rowan trees that lined the bank. Lugs sat by his feet, ears pricked toward the rustle of the wind. Hamish didn't have to wait long. Just as the church clock in the village centre struck 8, the back door of the hotel creaked open. A figure emerged, hunched low, moving with the rapid, jerky steps of someone who was being chased by their own shadow. It was Willie. He was carrying a heavy black refuse bag that looked suspiciously lumpy. He didn't head for the main bins. Instead, he hurried toward the burn, his eyes darting toward the hotel windows every few seconds. He reached the bank and, with a grunt of exertion, swung the bag back to heave it into the deepest part of the water. "That's a heavy load for a Tuesday night, Willie." The voice was soft, carrying across the water like a stone skipped on a pond. Willie froze, the bag slipping from his fingers and landing with a wet thud on the grass. He spun around, his face a mask of pure terror, as he saw Hamish emerging from the shadows of the rowan trees. "Hamish," Willie gasped, his voice thin. I was just taking out the kitchen refuse. The bin was full, in a bag that size, and all the way down to the burn." Hamish walked slowly forward, his hands deep in his coat pockets. He wasn't acting the fool now. His posture was straight, his eyes unblinking. "It's a long walk for a bit of rubbish, lad." Willie backed away until his heels hit the soft mud of the bank. "You don't understand. He was going to dig them up. He told me right to my face," he said. "A meditation labyrinth needs clear soil, and these old forgotten graves are just in the way." "The McFarlane Croft," Hamish said, his voice flat. "It's not just land to you, is it?" "My great-grandfather is buried on that brae," Willie spat, his voice rising in a jagged, painful sob. "And my grandmother." Sterling didn't care. He laughed. He said they were inconvenient history. "I just went up there to tell him he couldn't do it. I had the bottle of whisky. It was a gift from a guest. I thought if I shared a drink, maybe he'd listen. But he just mocked me. He said he'd have me sacked from the hotel if I didn't get off his property." Willie's hands were shaking so violently they looked like they were vibrating. "He tripped on the net, Hamish. He was ranting at me, waving his arms, and he stumbled. I didn't mean to, but I saw him go down, and I just kept the net tight. I thought, If you're going to desecrate this place, you can be the first thing buried in it. The silence that followed was heavy, filled only by the rushing of the burn and the distant, mournful call of a lone owl. "The boot, Willie?" Hamish asked. "I hid it," Willie whispered, pointing toward the black bag. "And the jumper. I was going to burn them both." Hamish sighed, a long, hollow sound. He had his confession, he had his physical evidence, but he still had the problem of DCI Blair. "Willie," Hamish said, his voice dropping to a low, intense command. "Listen to me. You're going to stay here. You're going to sit on that bag and you're not going to move. I have to go fetch DCI Blair. You're going to arrest me." "I'm going to do what's right," Hamish said. He turned and walked back toward the hotel, his mind racing. He couldn't just hand Willie over to Blair. The man would beat a confession out of the boy, destroy his reputation, and likely turn the trial into a media circus just to boost his own profile. Hamish stopped at the edge of the hotel lights. He pulled out his radio, the one he usually kept turned down to a whisper. "Strathbane, this is Macbeth," he said into the crackling receiver. "Macbeth? What the hell do you want?" Blair's voice blared back, sounding even more irritable than usual. "I've found the evidence, sir," Hamish said, keeping his tone carefully neutral, "and I believe I've found the person responsible for the incident on the Bray. It wasn't Angus MacDonald. I have the suspect held by the burn behind the hotel. They're ready to confess." There was a long silence on the other end, followed by a sharp, surprised intake of breath. You found the killer. You, the man who can't even fill out a parking citation correctly?" "I just happened to be in the right place, sir," Hamish said, his voice dropping into the familiar, slow, lazy drawl. "I was just looking for a bit of peace and quiet, and I stumbled on it. If you come quick, you can handle the arrest yourself. I'm sure it'll look grand in your report." Blair's voice shifted instantly, vibrating with greed. "Keep him there, Macbeth. Do not let him go. I'm coming down there now, and if this is a prank, God help you, I will have your badge before the sun rises." Hamish clicked off the radio, a small, sad smile touching his lips. He walked back toward the burn, ready to hand over the case, the credit, and the glory to the one man who had never suspected the lazy Highlander had orchestrated the entire thing. Chapter 10. The Quiet Return of the Highlander. The aftermath was exactly as Hamish had orchestrated. DCI Blair arrived with his usual bluster, sirens wailing despite the fact that the perpetrator was sitting calmly on a black refuse bag by the edge of a stream. Blair took charge with all the subtlety of a bull in a flower shop. He snatched the confession from Willie, ignored the boy's tearful explanation of the ancestral graves, and immediately began shouting into his radio about the brilliant investigative work of the Strathbane unit. He didn't even glance at Hamish, who stood in the background, hands shoved deep into his pockets, looking like a man who had been dragged out of bed and was already thinking about his next nap. By midnight, the cruisers had departed. The blue lights had faded from the damp stone walls of the village, and the silence of the Highlands had rushed back in to fill the void. Angus MacDonald had been released with a grumpy apology from a junior officer, which Angus accepted by slamming his front door in the policeman's face. The village of Lochdubh, resilient and perpetually suspicious of outsiders, began to settle. The gossip mill, however, was running at full capacity. Hamish walked back to his station, Lugs trotting faithfully at his side. He opened the door, and the familiar, comforting smell of stale tobacco, damp paper, and peat smoke greeted him. It was home. He didn't make a report. He didn't file a summary. He sat down at his desk, put his feet up, and pulled out his favorite coffee mug. Outside, the wind rattled the panes, but it no longer sounded like an insult. It sounded like a lullaby. The phone rang. It was probably a reporter from the Highland Chronicle, or, worse, Blair's superior wanting a formal statement. Hamish let it ring, once, twice, 3 times. He reached over, picked up the receiver, and hung it back up, without answering. "That's that then, Lugs," Hamish said, leaning back and closing his eyes. He had saved Angus. He had ensured justice for the desecrated graves, though the law would call it manslaughter, and he had kept himself firmly in the position of the useless PC Macbeth. Blair would get the promotion, the commendation, and the transfer to a city office where he could rot in a cubicle. Hamish would get to stay in his station, poach his salmon, and drink his coffee in peace. There was a soft knock at the door. Hamish didn't open his eyes. "If that's the minister asking about the collection plate, tell him I'm on patrol." The door creaked open, and the scent of expensive perfume, a sharp, crisp floral, drifted into the room. "It's not the minister, you lazy goat." Hamish opened one eye. Priscilla Halberton Smythe stood in the doorway, wrapped in a heavy wool coat, looking entirely out of place in the dingy station. She was carrying a small wrapped parcel. "I heard the news," she said, stepping inside and eyeing the dust on the floor with distaste. "Blair is taking all the credit, as predicted." He's already calling himself the hero of the Highlands. He's welcome to it, Hamish said, uncurling his long frame to stand up. It's a heavy burden being a hero. Very tiring. Priscilla set the parcel on his desk. It was a block of high-quality cheddar and a box of genuine buttery shortbread, the kind that didn't double as construction material. You played him perfectly, she said, her blue eyes searching his. You let him take the glory, and you kept your quiet little life. Doesn't it bother you that no one will ever know you're the one who actually solved it? That no either. That lucky water watermoy. Non to lubra blinho go refill. Hasaid with Tove. Hamish looked out the window at the dark, looming mountains, shrouded in the shifting mist. Lochdubh knows Priscilla, and that's the only opinion that matters. You're a strange man, Hamish Macbeth. Aye, he agreed, picking up a piece of the cheese, but I'm a well-fed one. Priscilla lingered for a moment, an unreadable expression on her face, before turning to leave. Try not to get murdered, or murder anyone, for at least a week. I'd like a quiet walk to the loch tomorrow. I make no promises, Hamish said with a grin. When she was gone, Hamish locked the door, turned off the flickering overhead light, and sat back down in the dark. He could hear the distant, comforting sound of the loch lapping against the stones. The village was safe, the intruder was gone, and tomorrow he had nothing to do. He pulled a fresh, clean sheet of paper toward him, stared at it for a long moment, and then crumpled it into a ball and tossed it into the bin. Perfect, he whispered. He stood up, whistled for Lugs, and headed toward his small cot in the back room. He was finally, blissfully, unproductively home. The mystery of the man who died or didn't was over, and in Lochdubh, that was the greatest victory of all. Chapter 11. The Long, Lazy Morning. The morning after the circus left town, the sun decided to make an appearance, a rare shimmering thing that turned the surface of the loch into a sheet of hammered silver. It was the kind of day that usually goaded people into activity. Gardeners began pruning, fishermen checked their nets, and even the local sheep seemed to move with more purpose. Hamish Macbeth, however, was immune to the charms of a productive morning. He was sat on the wooden bench outside the police station, his back against the peeling whitewash, watching a bumblebee navigate a patch of heather. He had a mug of tea resting on his knee, and for the first time in a week, the air didn't feel heavy with the impending arrival of DCI Blair or the frantic energy of an investigation. Lugs was stretched out in the sun, his tongue lolling out, snoring with a rhythmic, gentle whistle. "See that, Lugs?" Hamish murmured, not looking away from the bee. "That's the sound of absolutely nothing happening. It's glorious, isn't it?" The village was quiet. The post-murder atmosphere of tension had evaporated overnight, replaced by the usual, slow-motion rhythm of Highland life. Mrs. McPhee walked past, pushing her bicycle, and gave Hamish a curt, knowing nod. She didn't stop to gossip, which meant the village had already processed the events of the last few days and filed them away under the madness of Sassenachs. There was no need for talk. Lochdubh had a way of absorbing drama and turning it into a footnote. A shadow fell over him, and Hamish didn't look up, knowing by the heavy measured tread of the boots who it was. "I thought you'd be sleeping off your exhaustion," a familiar voice drawled. Hamish cracked one eye open. Priscilla Halberton Smythe was standing there, dressed for a hike, her walking stick held with the casual grace of a queen's scepter. "I was," Hamish said, taking a sip of his tea. "But the sun was being loud. It's hard to sleep when the light is shouting at you." Priscilla sat down on the far end of the bench, leaving a respectful distance between them. "I saw Blair leaving in his convoy early this morning. He looked absolutely radiant with his own importance. He gave an interview to the Strathbane Gazette from the driver's seat. Apparently his keen psychological profiling and relentless pursuit of the truth were the only things that stood between the village and total anarchy." Hamish chuckled, a low, rumbling sound in his chest. "Let him have his moment. It'll make it all the sweeter when he gets promoted to the paperwork department in the city." "You really hate the idea of leaving, don't you?" Priscilla asked, her tone softer, stripped of its usual sharp edge. Hamish looked out over the loch. He thought about the smog of a city, the constant, aggressive noise of traffic, the faces of people who didn't know his name, and the terrifying prospect of having to be ambitious. "I like my view," he said simply. "I like knowing that when the wind blows, it's coming off the hills, not off a motorway. And I like that nobody here expects me to be anything other than Hamish." Priscilla nodded slowly. "It's a small life, Hamish." "Aye," he agreed, "but it's mine, and it's full enough." They sat in silence for a long while, watching the light dance on the water. It was a comfortable silence, the kind that only exists between two people who have stopped trying to impress one another. "Are you going for a walk, then?" Hamish asked eventually. "I am," she replied, standing up and brushing a speck of dust from her trousers. Up the pass. The Rowans are turning early this year. Would you care to join me? Or is that too much of an exertion for a man of your refined sedentary habits? Hamish looked at his mug. He looked at Lugs, who had shifted positions to follow the patch of shade. He looked at his station, with its pile of unfiled reports and its promise of absolutely no work for the rest of the day. I suppose I could be persuaded, Hamish said, standing up and stretching until his spine gave a series of loud, satisfying pops. But only if we stop at the shop first. I need a packet of biscuits. The walking kind. The walking kind. Aye, Hamish said, flashing her a grin that didn't have a trace of the village idiot in it. The kind that makes the climb worth it. He locked the station door, left the keys in the usual place, a hollow brick behind the loose stone, and tipped his hat to the village. The murder mystery was closed. The records were hidden behind Blair's ego, and the Highlands were still, silent and perfect. As they started toward the pass, Hamish felt a lightness in his chest that had nothing to do with the lack of police work and everything to do with the familiar craggy horizon. He walked with a steady, long-legged gait, his eyes scanning the hills. He was exactly where he was meant to be, doing exactly nothing of importance, and for Hamish Macbeth, that was the ultimate success. Chapter 12. The proper way to end a week. The hike up the pass was not, by any objective standard, a brisk one. It was punctuated by frequent stops, mostly at Hamish's insistence, to examine the flora, which usually involved leaning heavily against a fence post and watching a cloud shadow crawl across the valley floor. Priscilla, to her credit, didn't complain. She walked with a steady, determined rhythm, her eyes bright with the exercise, occasionally pausing to wait for him with an amused quirk of her lips. Lugs, meanwhile, was in his element, nose to the ground, occasionally bursting into a frantic, short-lived sprint after a mountain hare that was always far too fast for him. By the time they reached the crest of the pass, the wind had picked up, carrying the sharp, clean scent of approaching rain. They stood together, looking out over the panoramic vista of the Highlands. The mountains stretched away in layers of blue and violet, like a painter's half-finished study, and the village of Lochdubh was nothing more than a cluster of white specks huddled against the dark, churning expanse of the water. "It's peaceful today," Priscilla said, her voice barely rising above the whistle of the wind. "Aye," Hamish replied. He was breathing heavily not from the exertion but from the sheer scale of the landscape. He pulled the packet of shortbread from his pocket, offered one to Priscilla, and then shoved a handful into his own mouth. "A bit too peaceful, maybe. Keeps the mind from getting lazy." "I think your mind is far from lazy, Hamish," she said, chewing the biscuit thoughtfully. "You spent the last few days running circles around the Strathbane police, protecting the villagers, and uncovering a tragedy, all while pretending you couldn't tie your own laces. That isn't laziness. It's a very specific kind of discipline." Hamish shrugged, looking away. He didn't like being analysed. It was too close to being understood, and being understood was a dangerous thing for a man who made his living by being underestimated. "I just like things to stay as they are, Priscilla," he said softly. "Lochdubh doesn't need justice in the city sense. It needs balance. When someone like Sterling comes in and starts pulling at the threads, the whole fabric starts to unravel. My job is just to make sure the knot is tied back together so nobody else gets caught in the loops." Priscilla looked at him for a long, searching moment. "And what about you? Are you ever going to be a part of the fabric, or are you just going to keep standing on the edge holding the needles?" Hamish didn't answer. He watched a golden eagle circling high above, a solitary speck against the vastness of the sky. He had no answer for her, not really. He was a man made of the Highlands, of the mist, the damp, and the stubborn silence of the glens. To be a part of the fabric meant change, and change was the one thing he feared more than any DCI in the country. "I'm just a policeman, Priscilla," he said finally, "and I've got a patrol to get back to." "A patrol?" she laughed. "You haven't been on a real patrol in 3 years." "I patrol the pub, the post office, and the occasional tea shop," he said, turning back toward the descent. "It's a demanding life, very demanding." The walk back down was easier, the gravity of the mountain pulling them toward the familiar warmth of the village. As they reached the outskirts, the first fat, cold droplets of rain began to fall, turning the dusty path into a slick, dark ribbon. Hamish stopped at the crossroads where the road split, one way toward the Halberton Smythe estate, the other toward the police station. "I should go," Priscilla said. She reached out and patted his arm, a gesture that was both affectionate and slightly firm. "Try to get some actual sleep tonight, Hamish. And if you hear of any more accidental deaths, do try to make it look like you didn't solve them." "I'll do my best," Hamish promised. He watched her walk away, her figure becoming a dark silhouette against the grey, rain-swept sky. He felt a sudden, sharp twinge of loneliness, but he shoved it into the same pocket where he kept his badge. "Come on, Lugs. he said to the dog, who was shivering slightly as the storm began in earnest. "Let's get home." He reached the station just as the heavens opened, turning the world into a blur of grey light. He stepped inside, locked the door, and leaned against the wood, listening to the rain hammer against the roof. It was the best music he knew. He didn't turn on the light. He went to his small, cluttered kitchenette, boiled the kettle, and made a pot of tea so strong it could have stood a spoon upright. He sat in his chair, stared out at the rain-drenched street, and sighed. The case was forgotten. The intruder was a memory. Tomorrow he would walk to the shop, talk to Mr. Patel about the price of tea, and wander down to the loch to watch the fishermen. It was a perfect, quiet, uneventful life. Hamish Macbeth, the laziest policeman in the Highlands, smiled in the dark. He had everything he wanted, and not a single thing had changed. In Lochdubh, that was the ultimate victory.